Imagine you are handed a problem, not a riddle, not a puzzle, a mathematical problem that has stumped every scholar in Europe. A Dutch mathematician named Adriaan van Roomen has published it in 1593 as an open challenge to the entire learned world. A polynomial equation of the 45th degree, a towering, almost incomprehensible construction of terms and powers, the kind of thing that would make a modern university professor reach for coffee before even reading the second line. Every court in Europe falls silent. Not one mathematician dares to answer. Then a French lawyer, not even a professional mathematician, sits down, reads it, and solves it. Not in weeks, not in days. In a single afternoon, in front of the ambassador of King Henry IV of France. His name was Francois Viete. And the reason he could do what no one else could is not the story you think it is. Because the real secret, the one history almost missed, had nothing to do with genius in the way we usually define it. It had everything to do with how he was made. And by the end of this story, you will understand something most people never realize about how truly transforming ideas are born. Welcome to Numbers and Narratives by Bless Wright, the channel where mathematics is not just calculated, but felt. Today we go deep into the life of Francois Viete, the 16th century Frenchman who rewired the language of mathematics itself. He introduced something so fundamental that every equation you have ever written or seen, every x, every y, every unknown variable, descends directly from his mind. Before Viete, algebra was written in words and specific numbers. After Viete, it became a living symbolic language capable of expressing universal truths. But here is what most people never stop to ask. How does a lawyer become the father of modern algebra? What was growing in him long before he ever wrote a single equation? What pressures, what losses, what obsessions shaped the mind that would change mathematics forever? If this kind of storytelling is what you came for, subscribe now and hit the bell, because the full answer to those questions, the real reveal about what made Viete different from every mathematician before him, is coming at the end of this film, and it will reframe everything. The year is 1540. The place is Fontenay-le-Comte, a small but remarkable town in the Poitou region of western France. It sits along the banks of the Vendée River, and in the 16th century, it is something rarer than most European towns of its size. It is awake. Fontenay-le-Comte is a town that punches well above its weight intellectually. A generation before Francois Viete is born there, the great satirist Francois Rabelais also walked its streets, studying law and dreaming of a different kind of world. The Franciscan monastery in Fontenay-le-Comte has a library. The humanist tradition, the Renaissance hunger for ancient knowledge recovered and renewed, is not an abstraction here. It is alive in the conversations of its lawyers, its noblemen, its clergy. Into this environment, Francois Viete is born. His father, Etienne Viete, is a man of the law, a procureur, a legal practitioner, a man who lives and breathes the discipline of precise argument. To be a procureur in 16th century France is not merely to be a document handler, it is to understand how language constructs reality. A legal practitioner must read contracts and see their hidden architecture. He must listen to testimonies and detect their logical structure. He must argue cases by building chains of reasoning that hold under the pressure of scrutiny. Etienne Viete works with words the way an engineer works with stone. Deliberately, structurally, with an eye always on what holds and what collapses. This matters enormously, because what young Francois absorbs at home, before he ever sits in a classroom, is not just the content of knowledge, but the method of it. He watches his father construct arguments. Now he sees how a proposition must be stated clearly before it can be evaluated. He learns in the ordinary rhythms of a lawyer's household that precision is not pedantry, it is power. His mother, Marguerite Dupont, comes from a family with its own standing in the region. The home Francois grows up in is not wealthy in the ostentatious sense, but it is stable and educated. A household where books are not luxuries and where the question of how one thinks about a problem is taken seriously. There is an emotional climate in such homes that historians of science have rarely attended to carefully enough. The feeling that ideas matter, that thinking carefully about something is a form of respect toward it, and that the world rewards those who do not rush to easy answers. That climate, invisible and unmeasurable, is one of the most powerful shaping forces in the life of any exceptional mind. France in 1540 is a country at an intellectual crossroads. The Renaissance has swept through Italy and is now transforming France. Architecture, painting, literature, philosophy, and yes, mathematics are all being reborn. The printing press, invented less than a century before, has shattered the monopoly of the monasteries on knowledge. Ideas that once took decades to travel from city to city now spread in years. Translations of ancient Greek texts, Euclid, Archimedes, Diophantus, are appearing in printed editions. Scholars are rediscovering that the Greeks had solved problems that the medieval world had simply forgotten existed. But France is also a country tearing itself apart. The Protestant Reformation, sparked in Germany by Luther a generation earlier, has ignited a religious civil war in France that will consume the country for decades. The conflict between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, is not merely theological. It is political, dynastic, and deeply personal. Families are split. Careers are made and destroyed by which side of the conflict you inhabit. The town of Fontenay-le-Comte is a center of Huguenot sympathy, and this places the entire community in a permanent state of tension with Catholic royal authority. Young Francois Viete grows up in a world where what you believe can cost you everything, and where the ability to encode your thoughts, to speak in ways that are not immediately transparent to hostile ears, is not merely an intellectual skill, but a survival skill. He attends school locally before going on to pursue legal studies, and we know from what his mind later produces that his education is humanist in orientation, meaning it prizes Latin, Greek, rhetoric, logic, and the recovery of ancient learning. He studies at the University of Poitiers, one of the oldest and most respected law schools in France, where he earns his licentiate in law around 1559. He is 19 years old, newly trained in the art of systematic argument, equipped with Latin and likely some Greek, and returning to his home province with a legal career ahead of him. What no document can quite capture is what is already stirring beneath the professional surface. Because at Poitiers, and in the intellectual atmosphere of the humanist Renaissance, Viete encounters something that will quietly redirect his entire interior life. Ancient mathematics. Not the arithmetic of merchants, not the rough algebra of Italian commercial schools, though he will encounter that too. The deeper, more philosophical tradition of Greek mathematics, particularly the work of the ancient Greek algebraist Diophantus of Alexandria, whose text the Arithmetica is beginning to circulate in Latin translation. Diophantus works with unknowns, with quantities that have no fixed value, with the idea that a number can be a placeholder for something yet to be determined. It is, in embryo, the idea that will define Viete's life. But there is something missing in Diophantus that Viete, trained in the rigorous abstraction of legal language, begins to sense. Every time Diophantus solves a problem, he solves it for a specific case. He finds specific numbers. He does not, and perhaps could not, think about how to solve all problems of a given type simultaneously. His language does not permit it. And here is where Adriaan Viete's household begins to do its quiet work inside his son's mathematical imagination. A lawyer does not argue one case. A lawyer argues a type of case. A legal principle is not an answer to a single question. It is a framework that answers all questions of that kind. The legal mind trained by Adriaan Viete and then sharpened at Poitiers is a mind trained to think in generalities without losing precision. It is a mind that asks not what is the answer to this problem, but what is the structure that all problems of this kind share. This is the seed. It is planted quietly with no fanfare, somewhere in the overlap between a father's household, a university's law library, and a young man's private fascination with ancient Greek mathematics. And it will not bloom for decades, but it is already alive. After completing his legal studies, Viete returns to Fontenay-le-Comte and begins his career as a lawyer. He is successful, he is organized and precise, qualities his training and upbringing have made second nature. But something else is also beginning during these years, something that will reshape the entire trajectory of his life. Around 1564, Viete enters the household of Jean de Parthenay, one of the most distinguished Protestant noblemen in Western France, as a legal advisor. And there he meets Jean de Parthenay's daughter, Catherine de Parthenay. If she is still a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old at most, and Viete becomes her tutor. This tutoring relationship is one of the most important and under-examined chapters in the story of modern algebra. Catherine de Parthenay is not an ordinary student. She is, by all accounts, ferociously intelligent, genuinely curious about mathematics, and capable of serious independent thought. She will later in her life compose poetry, translate works of scholarship, and correspond with leading intellectuals of her era. In Viete's lifetime, she is the person to whom he dedicates his most important mathematical works, and the relationship runs deeper than dedications. Catherine's questions, her engagement, her sheer intellectual appetite are part of what pulls Viete more and more seriously into mathematical investigation. When you teach someone who is truly exceptional, you do not merely transmit knowledge, you are forced to understand it more deeply than you ever did before. You are forced to explain things you thought you understood and discover that you do not fully understand them yet. Teaching Catherine de Parthenay does something to Viete that no solitary study ever could. It forces his mathematics to become communicable. It forces him to find a language. The Parthenay household is also politically charged. The wars of religion are burning through France. Jean de Parthenay is a leader of the Huguenot community, and the household is a node in the Protestant resistance to Catholic royal pressure. Viete is a man of sympathy for the Reformed faith, and his proximity to the Parthenay family places him firmly in this world of coded communication, the dangerous allegiances, and the constant need to say one thing in ways that can mean different things to different audiences. This context matters more than it might seem, because Viete is not just a lawyer tutoring a nobleman's daughter. He is a man living inside a culture of encoding. A culture where the ability to conceal meaning within a formal structure is not an intellectual game, but a political necessity. And that sensibility, the sensibility of the cipher, of the code, of the symbol that stands for something else, will become the precise sensibility of his mathematics. By the 1570s, Viete is rising in the world of French royal administration. He becomes a member of the Breton Parliament and then, around 1580, a privy councillor to King Henry III of France himself. He is now at the heart of French royal power. And it is here that his skills as a cryptanalyst first become dramatically apparent. Spain and France are rivals. Spanish diplomatic correspondence, encrypted in sophisticated ciphers that the Spanish believe are impenetrable, is being intercepted by French intelligence, but no one can read it. The Spanish are confident their codes are safe, and then Viete is given the intercepts. What follows is one of the genuinely astonishing episodes of the 16th century. Viete cracks the Spanish diplomatic ciphers. He does so repeatedly and comprehensively, allowing Henry III to read Philip II's most sensitive communications for years. When the Spanish finally discover what has happened, Philip II reportedly accuses France of using sorcery. He cannot believe that a human mind could have done this unaided. But Viete's mind could, precisely because breaking a cipher and doing mathematics are, at their deepest level, the same activity. Both require you to look at a formal structure and ask, what pattern is hiding here? What is the rule that generated this? What variable, if I name it and manipulate it correctly, will unlock the whole structure? This is Viete in his 40s, a royal counselor, a cryptanalyst, a tutor of a brilliant noblewoman, a child of a lawyer's household in a humanist Protestant town, a man in whom all these experiences are now converging toward a single, transformative idea. And then in 1584, everything stops. The reasons are not entirely clear. Historians have debated them. But around 1584, Francois Viete is removed from the royal council. He loses his position at court. He is, in the terminology of the age, in disgrace. The religious tensions that have always simmered around him, and possibly the political maneuvering of rivals, have combined to expel him from the center of power. He retires to his estates in the country, and in that silence, cut off from the court, from the pressures of administration and diplomacy, Francois Viete does what very few men in history have had both the preparation and the opportunity to do. He thinks continuously and without distraction for 5 years. The exile lasts from approximately 1584 to 1589, And it is in these years that everything Viete has been building since his father's household, since Poitiers, since the Parthenay tutoring sessions, since the cipher rooms of Henry III's court, finally crystallizes into something that will outlast every royal council, every diplomatic intrigue, every war of religion by centuries. He publishes the In Artem Analyticum Isagoge in 1591, Introduction to the Analytic Art. It is a short book, deceptively short, but what it contains will rewrite the foundations of mathematics. Here is the core of what Viete does, and it requires a moment's careful attention to appreciate its full magnitude. Before Viete, algebra, the art of solving equations, was written either in words or in symbols that represented only specific unknown quantities. The Italian algebraists of the 15th and 16th centuries, men like Luca Pacioli, Girolamo Cardano, and Niccolò Tartaglia, had made significant advances. They could solve cubic and quartic equations, equations involving the third and fourth powers of an unknown, but their algebra was always about a particular problem. They might write the unknown as cosa, the Italian word for thing, or use the symbol res, the Latin word for thing. But the known quantities in the problem, the coefficients, the numbers attached to the powers of the unknown, were always actual, specific numbers: 3, 7, 12, 1,000. Whatever the problem required, this meant that if you solved a cubic equation with the coefficient of the unknown squared being, say, 6, your solution worked for that problem only. If someone came to you with a cubic where the coefficient was 9, you had to start over. Every solution was particular. Every result was local. Viete asks a question that, once asked, seems almost obvious, and yet no one had asked it with full force before. What if we gave names not just to the unknowns, but to the knowns as well? What if, and instead of writing actual numbers for the coefficients, we used letters, symbols that could stand for any number of a given type? He develops a system in which vowels, A, E, I, O, U, represent the quantities being sought, the unknowns, and consonants, B, C, D, G, and so on, represent the known quantities, the parameters of the problem. And then, crucially, he manipulates these letters according to the rules of algebra, just as one would manipulate specific numbers. The result is something the world has never seen before: a general algebra, an algebra of forms. He calls it logistica speciosa, literally the logistic of species, the algebra of symbolic types, as opposed to logistica numerosa, the ordinary algebra of specific numbers. For the first time in history, an equation is not a statement about particular quantities. Why? It is a statement about the relationship between quantities of a given kind. It is universal. Think about what this means. If Viete writes that a cubed plus b times a equals z, using his vowel and consonant notation, he has not solved one problem. He has solved an entire class of problems. Every cubic equation of that form, no matter what values b and z might have in a specific case, is now addressed by his general solution. The solution covers infinitely many particular problems at once. This is what mathematicians call a parametric or general solution. And while glimpses of the idea had appeared earlier, in the work of the ancient Greek Diophantus and in some Renaissance algebraists, no one had formalized it, systematized it, and made it the explicit foundation of a new algebraic method with the clarity and completeness that Viete achieves. He is explicit about what he is doing and why it is revolutionary. He writes that his aim is to introduce a new art, not merely a new technique, but a new way of thinking about what a mathematical problem is. The old algebra hunts for a specific query, one particular answer. Viete's new algebra hunts for the law, the general rule from which all particular answers can be derived. And this shift from the particular to the general, from the solution to the structure, is inseparable from the mind that produced it. A lawyer's son who grew up watching his father construct general legal principles from particular cases. A tutor who learned to find the deepest structure of an idea by explaining it to an exceptional student. A cryptanalyst who learned to look at a mass of particular symbols and ask, what general law generated all of this? Following the Isagoge, Viete publishes a series of related works across the 1590s. the Zeticorum Libri Quinque, the De Aequationum Recognitione et Emendatione, the Supplementum Geometriae, and others, that develop his analytic art in full technical detail. He applies his new algebra to the solution of equations of different degrees. He connects algebra to geometry in ways that anticipate, by half a century, the coordinate geometry of Descartes. He derives extraordinarily precise trigonometric identities. You're expressing the sine and cosine of multiple angles in terms of those of single angles. Work so technically demanding that it fills pages of careful symbolic manipulation. And then in 1593 comes the moment we began with. Adriaan van Roomen publishes his challenge problem, a polynomial equation of the 45th degree involving one unknown. Its solution requires navigating a labyrinth of mathematical complexity that no one in Europe can penetrate. The challenge is meant to demonstrate the limits of what any algebraist can achieve. Henry IV's ambassador from the Netherlands presents it to the French court. The French king, apparently stung by the implication that France has no mathematician equal to the challenge, turns to Viete. Viete looks at the equation. He recognizes in its structure, in the fingerprint of a trigonometric identity, specifically the formula that expresses the sine of 45 times an angle in terms of the sine of the original angle. Because he has spent years developing precisely these kinds of multiple angle identities, he can see instantly what the equation is. He can see through the specific to the general law beneath it. He solves it and offers 23 distinct solutions. Then, as an act of intellectual generosity, or perhaps gentle counter-challenge, he poses Van Roomen a problem of his own, one involving the classical problem of Apollonius, requiring the construction of a circle tangent to three given circles. Van Roomen, to his immense credit, eventually comes to France to meet Viete in person. The two men become friends. None of this came without cost. And here we must resist the temptation that every documentary about genius faces, the temptation to make the struggle merely dramatic, to use it as seasoning for the triumph, rather than as a genuinely human dimension of the story. The exile of 1584 to 1589 was not a romantic retreat. Viete was a man who had built his career in the corridors of royal power, who had served his king with distinction, who had broken ciphers that protected national security. To be removed from that world, for reasons that may have included both religious suspicion and the envy of political rivals, was a genuine wound. He was not a monk who had chosen solitude. He was a counselor who had had solitude thrust upon him. The wars of religion, which frame his entire adult life, were not merely a backdrop. They were a constant and mortal danger to people like Viete, men of Protestant sympathy working in a Catholic royal administration, navigating between identities, never fully safe on either side. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, in which thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered across France, happened during Viete's years of rising influence. He knew people who died in it. Catherine de Parthenay's first husband, Charles de Téligny, was killed in that massacre. The violence was not historical background for Viete. It was the landscape of his world. He also published his mathematical works largely at his own expense, in small print runs distributed to a narrow audience. He was not celebrated as a mathematician in his lifetime. His books were not bestsellers. His contemporaries admired his legal and political service, and one in a small circle of mathematically sophisticated readers appreciated what he was doing in his technical publications. But the full magnitude of his contribution would only become visible after his death, and only when the work of Descartes, who absorbed and built upon Viete's innovations while introducing his own crucial modifications, made the new symbolic algebra fully visible to the mathematical world. Viete died in Paris in February of 1603. He left behind an unfinished body of mathematical work, a set of innovations that would require the following century to fully digest, and a personal life about which we know far less than we would wish. He had married late in life a woman named Julienne Leclerc, with whom he had a daughter. He had served three kings, Henry III, the short-lived Francis II, if we count his earliest service, and one in Henry IV, across one of the most turbulent half-centuries in French history. He was in many ways a lonely figure mathematically. He had no school of disciples. He had no university position. He published works whose full implications were apparent only to himself and perhaps to a handful of readers. He worked for most of his mathematical life essentially alone, a man conducting a private revolution in the language of mathematics while simultaneously fulfilling the public obligations of a royal bureaucrat. That loneliness was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was quieter and harder than that. It was the loneliness of having an idea so new that the categories for appreciating it do not yet exist, and of writing books that are technically rigorous and conceptually revolutionary and watching them gather dust while the world attends to other things. Here is what history almost always gets wrong about Francois Viete. The standard account presents him as a mathematician who had a clever idea about notation, who thought to use letters where others used specific numbers, and thereby advance the craft of algebra. It is a true account, but it is a thin account, and thinness, when it comes to the lives of transformative thinkers, is a kind of falsehood. Because the real question, the question that unlocks everything, is not what Viete did. It is what kind of mind does what Viete did. Think about what his innovation actually required. Why, it required someone who could look at a specific problem and refuse to be satisfied with a specific answer. Someone who could solve a problem correctly and then say, yes, but that is not enough. I want to understand all problems of this type. I want the law, not the instance. That is not a mathematical instinct alone. That is a legal instinct. It is the instinct of a man trained to think in precedent and principle, in the general rule that governs the specific case. Etienne Viete's household, the procurer's home in Fontenay-le-Comte, produced this instinct long before his son ever opened a mathematics book, and it required someone who had spent years in the discipline of encoding, of understanding that a symbol can carry a general meaning, that a letter can stand in for a quantity the way a legal term stands in for a class of events. And the cipher rooms of Henry III's court were not incidental to Viete's mathematical development. They were a rehearsal for it. Every diplomatic code he broke was an exercise in exactly the kind of thinking his algebra required. Given a formal structure of symbols, deduce the general law that governs their relationships. And it required, perhaps above all, the pedagogical experience of teaching Catherine de Parthenay. Because when you teach someone truly exceptional, you cannot afford to know your subject shallowly. You are forced to understand it at the level of structure, not just procedure. You have to be able to say not just, here is how you do this, but here is why this works the way it does. Here is the deeper principle. Viete spent years articulating mathematical ideas to one of the sharpest minds of his generation. That experience pressed him toward exactly the kind of deep structural thinking that his new algebra embodies. But there is one more dimension to this, one that most histories of mathematics pass over almost entirely because it belongs to the world of faith rather than the world of formula. Francois Viete was a man of the Reformed faith, a man of Protestant sympathies, living in a world where the Catholic Church had for centuries been the guardian of all knowledge. And the humanist Protestant intellectual culture that shaped Fontenay-le-Comte was a culture passionately committed to the idea that truth is not the property of any institution. That truth is universal, that it belongs to anyone with the discipline and the intelligence to pursue it. That a formula which is true for all cases, not just the ones the authority has examined. This is not a marginal detail. The universality of truth, the insistence that a mathematical principle holds for all cases, not just particular ones, is a deeply Protestant intellectual instinct in the context of 16th century France. It is the insistence that the general law, not the specific ruling of an established authority, is what matters. Viete's algebra, with its insistence on the universal over the particular, its demand for a general solution rather than a specific answer, carries the signature of this cultural and spiritual formation in a way that no biography of him has fully articulated. What truly made Viete different from every algebraist before him was not superior intelligence in some raw, unformed sense. It was the extraordinarily specific combination of experiences and formations that made his particular kind of thinking both possible and necessary. He was a lawyer's son who became a lawyer, who became a politician, who became a cryptanalyst, who became a tutor, who became an exile, who became, in that exile, the man who gave algebra its permanent language. Every one of those identities mattered, not as a curriculum vitae, as a series of pressures that shaped the exact cognitive tools required for the exact innovation that history needed from him. This is what most accounts of great mathematicians miss. They present the achievement as if it dropped from the sky, as if genius is a kind of weather, something that simply happens to certain people. But Viete's story shows us that the most revolutionary mathematical idea of his century was not a flash of inspiration. It was the slow, inevitable product of a very specific life, lived in a very specific way, under a very specific set of pressures and privileges and losses. The particular produced the general. How very Viete of history to arrange things that way. Every time you write x in an equation, every time you assign a letter to an unknown, every time you write a formula that is meant to hold not just for one set of numbers, but for all numbers of a certain kind, you are working in a language that Francois Viete invented. That is not metaphor. That is literal historical fact. The symbolic algebra that underlies every modern scientific equation, every engineering formula, every algorithm, every piece of mathematical reasoning in physics or chemistry or economics or computer science descends in a direct and traceable line from the In Artem Analyticum Isagoge of 1591. And Viete built that language not because he was born different from other men. He built it because he was formed differently, because a lawyer father in a humanist town taught him by example to think in principles, because a brilliant noblewoman in a noble household forced him to articulate what he knew, because a cipher room full of intercepted Spanish dispatches trained him to see the general law hiding beneath a particular instance, because a religious civil war taught him that some truths are too important to leave unspoken, and that the best way to speak them safely is to find a language general enough to outlast the conflicts of any particular moment. Francois Viete did not just change mathematics. He showed us, though he would never have said it this way, that the deepest ideas are not born in the abstract. They are born in the particular, in the daily friction of specific lives, in the unglamorous accumulation of learning and teaching and failing and being forced out of the comfortable rooms and into the quiet ones where the real work finally gets done. His father's household made him precise. His student made him deep. His exile made him free. His faith made him universal. That is how a mind becomes great, not in one moment, in 1,000 ordinary ones. Adara that no one watching could have recognized as the slow building of something the world did not yet have a name for. If this film gave you something, a new way of seeing how great ideas are born, a deeper understanding of the relationship between a life and a mind, please share it with someone who loves this kind of story. Leave a comment telling us whose story you want us to go deep on next. Subscribe to Numbers and Narratives by Blesswright. And remember, behind every formula, there is a formation. Behind every equation, there is a life. That is what this channel exists to show you. Thank you for watching.